Welcome to the Christian Men at Work podcast, where I interview men from all walks of life with varying job titles who have one thing in common. They are all choosing daily to live out their Christian faith through their work, and because of that they are leading, prospering, glorifying God, and experiencing joy and purpose in their work, and you can too. Men at Work, welcome to episode 190. Today we're going to be talking with Erin Ahnfeldt. Erin teaches English in a public high school, and he's been doing so for more than 2 decades, and he's passionate about using his writing and teaching to point to a God who is very much present in the secular and the day-to-day. He also writes honest stories to a list of subscribers about the struggles and beauty of being a Christian teacher in a public school. Let's get right to our interview. Hey, Erin, thanks a lot for joining the podcast today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Dave. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate this.
No problem. Thanks for joining us. So let's get right to our first question. I always like to ask people, tell us a little bit about how you came to faith in Christ. What was your age and what were some of the circumstances around that?
Right. Well, I grew up in a Christian family with some incredible parents who loved Jesus well. They hosted a Bible study once a week. And I remember watching these people come into our house, and they were sharing vulnerably, honestly with my parents, and they would pray together. They would open up the scriptures together, and they really became a family. And my parents are still hosting those Bible studies, so that was a big part of it. Plus, my dad he's a doctor, and so I knew that he would pray with his patients. And he would ask them, is it okay if we pray? And they'd say, usually nine times out of 10, they'd say yes. And they'd pray together. And then after the surgery, which usually went well because my dad was a good doctor, after the surgery, they would thank him for just praying for them and helping them with their perspective and offering some comfort through that prayer. So watching my dad as a leader in the workplace for Christ was a big piece of it. And then he used to call my mom a storm walker, because she was not one to run from difficult circumstances. When people were struggling, she would run towards those hard things and be present with people in the midst of divorce, in the midst of losing someone they loved, in the midst of cancer. And so I grew up watching her on the phone for hours at a time, talking with people, meeting with people for lunch, praying with people. So I knew that there was a God out there who sees us and who cares about our struggles and who listens to us when we pray. And this might be a little bit TMI, but I remember being a little guy, and I used to struggle with being lactose intolerant and having a stomach ache. And I remember being in the bathroom praying for God to help me deal with this stomach ache, get me through this, God, I'd pray. And I remember knowing that he was listening to me, that he cared about even my stomach ache. So whether I was praying in the bathroom or praying with friends, I knew that there was a God who listened. And if Jesus was that God who would listen to me and who saw me, who was with me in the midst of struggle, I wanted to follow him. So I knew early on that he was the God who cared.
What a great testimony about your parents. You had parents that didn't just check the Christian box, so to speak, and go to church on Sunday. They were living it out, each in their own different ways, which is so powerful. And I would think laid a foundation for your faith, not just to make that decision for Christ, but kind of maybe set a path for you as far as what the walk looks like. Can you talk a little bit more about your parents?
Oh yeah, I think the best part of growing up with them was the communication piece. They were real with us. So when they were struggling, when things were hard, they would be honest about it, and they would also bring God into it and talk about how he was there present with them in the midst of their difficulty. And I remember we'd have, this would always happen before a Bible study, and you know how this goes before church or whatever, some spiritual thing you're going to do. We would get in fights. There'd be like a fight or something would go wrong, and there'd be kids fighting. And my mom would say, hey guys, we need to pray right now because I think we're facing kind of a spiritual battle. Let's pray together. And so she taught us to look towards eternal things rather than earthly things early on, just through prayer and just being real with their faith. Like they lived it out in front of us.
Well, and taught you a lesson about how to deal with challenges and strife instead of blaming others or just getting angry or just going to God with that solution. What a powerful lesson.
Oh, definitely, definitely. And it really taught me a lot, just as being a dad now with teenagers, how to just be real with them and not blame each other, but go to God and recognize your own flaws and your own need for help and look to God for that help.
With regard to your dad, I mean, we're going to talk about, how you've been living out your faith in the workplace. Obviously, he must have had a big impact on that type of approach to your faith. And what an awesome story that he courageously incorporated his faith into his medical practice. Did he share with you the fact that he did that? I mean, how were you aware that that was a part of his kind of daily work life?
Great question. I think a lot of doctors probably have this, but around Christmas, there are all these gifts that come in the mail for patients saying thank you for what the doctor's done for them. So my dad would get all these gifts in the mail, and there'd be letters, and they'd say how much they appreciated the fact that he helped them through this, whatever. He was an orthopedic surgeon, so helped them with their knee surgery or shoulder surgery. And then they'd always say, and thank you for praying for me, because that helped me to understand that there's a God who's in control in the midst of this hard, surgery that we're facing in this difficult circumstance. So when people are vulnerable, I think with we're all vulnerable when we're around a doctor because we've got some kind of issue going on. For a doctor to come in with this peace and this love for God, it's just a powerful way to shine your light. And he would share that with us. We talk about, there's this patient that came in, we prayed together, and the surgery went great, and God answered prayer. So he would talk about it at the dinner table, and we'd see these letters that would come in the mail. So he'd be honest with us and talk to us about it. And it wasn't ever bragging. It was just kind of, this is a cool thing that God did. This is how God showed up.
Well, and it sounds like it wasn't just like a once in a while thing. It was kind of like just the way he went about his work.
Definitely. It was a common part of his job every day. When he'd go to surgery, he'd ask these patients, do you want me to pray with you? And the Gazette actually wrote an article about it. The Gazette's a newspaper here in Colorado Springs. They wrote an article about dads praying with patients, and he was bold, just talking about his faith and shared in that article in this interview that he had that this was a real part of his practice, and he wasn't ashamed of it.
Did he ever talk to you about any negative feedback he got, either from patients or from maybe his superiors, about how he did his work? Actually,
no. First of all, he was an Army doctor for 20 years, and then he went into private practice. But throughout that time, he would obviously ask people, can I pray for you? And then if people said no, he'd be okay. He'd say that's fine, and he'd say, we'll go into surgery, and he'd talk them through what they're going to do and what's going to happen. But 9 times out of 10, people would say, oh, please do pray for me. I would love that, especially since people are so vulnerable when they're facing surgery. They're kind of, they're unsure and wondering what's going to happen. And so for this doctor to come in confidently and say, hey, it's going to be okay, and I know what I'm doing, and I want to pray for you. Can I pray for you? And people just love that.
Well, I found the same to be true, whether it's someone serving at a restaurant or anyone that I've come into contact, or people that I work with. It's so rare where somebody refuses that or says, no, I'd rather not. And it also reminds me that, we get these messages in our culture today that, there's certain taboos that you just don't do, separation of church and state and all that. And I think we're kind of conditioned to keep our faith private. And there's a fear there, I think, for a lot of people that's not justified. So I love hearing a testimony like you and your dad, to just remind people that, you know what, the world's not going to end if you step out in faith and say something that you're a little uncomfortable with.
Amen. So true. So true.
All right. Well, I want to talk briefly about your experience at Wheaton College. So I've heard about Wheaton College off and on over the years. I know it's a well-known Christian university. I mean, some people that come to mind are like, who's the guy that made the VeggieTales? Phil, I can't forget his last name. Anyway, I know it's a great university from what I've heard. So you went there to get your master's, is that right?
Yes, I got my master's in teaching.
Were you physically on the campus, or was it like online, or?
Well, I went there as an undergrad first, and really I got interested because I was in a youth group in Virginia. We lived in Virginia for a while because my dad was in the military, like I mentioned, and so we were stationed in Virginia. And I had this great youth group, and there were seniors who went to this youth group where I looked up to, football players, guys who could drive, and I was a freshman, and these guys would just take me under their wing and love on me and be an encouragement. And then they went off to college, and a bunch of them went to Wheaton College. So I heard about this great school, this great Christian school that they loved, and they said, you got to check this out. So my dad and I told my dad, we got to go there. We got to check this school out. So we flew there together, and then we got a rental car. And I remember driving over the tracks at Wheaton. And as you drive over the tracks, and you're immediately on campus as you drive over these tracks, and there's a sign there, this big stone sign that says Wheaton College for Christ and His Kingdom. And I remember seeing that sign. We were coming in. It was probably 8:30 or 9 o'clock at night. And we're coming in, and I saw that sign, and my heart just leapt within me because I had been in a public school all my life, and we wanted to be bold with our faith, but there's a little bit of feeling like you're in the underground. You're meeting with people, like we were meeting with other Christians in our public school for Bible study at lunch or something. You feel like you're going against the flow, and you're fighting to make a difference, but it's a fight, it's a battle, it's difficult. And I remember thinking when I saw that sign, oh God, thank you for a place where I don't have to feel like I'm battling all the time, where there's people that are supporting me and with me who are going to help me with my faith. So that just meant the world to me to see that sign. And then the next day, Dave, this was incredible, but the next day was a chapel, and the students were sharing testimonies. There were seniors sharing testimonies of what experiences they'd had at Wheaton. And they're up there in tears talking about what God had done in their lives at that school and the ministries they were a part of and their Bible studies. And it just, I had to go there once I listened to those people give their testimonies and share like they did. So that got me really excited, and I went and loved it. But also found that it was a struggle. There were a lot of things I struggled with once I left my Christian home, my great Christian home, and ended up in the college. There's a lot of things I struggled with that I can tell you about if you want.
Yeah, if you don't mind, share a couple of those.
Yeah, so I'm a perfectionist. So one struggle I had going into college was wondering if I was really a Christian. I kind of struggled with, have I checked all the boxes? Have I confessed that Jesus is Lord? And have I asked for forgiveness? Have I repented enough? And there was this lie that salvation kind of was in my hands and it was up to me. So I kind of grappled with this, and then that turned into these doubts I had, and wondering if this home that I came from, if my parents had, if they really knew what they're talking about. I began to question everything. And I went to this concert. You probably remember Petra, Dave. I don't know if you remember Petra, the great Christian band of the 90s, early 90s.
Yeah, I actually didn't get into Christian music until 2000. But I have, in a retro sense, gone back and gotten some of the music, including Petra. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so this band was just people were so excited about this band, and they came to Wheaton, and they were in this auditorium doing a concert, and my roommates and I figured out a way to get in there and listen to this band do their concert, and we got in front row seats. And so everybody's excited, and the band starts playing their huge songs, This Means War, and all these different songs that and they have this, just huge sound, and everybody's jumping up and down and all excited. And I remember, because of the struggle that I remember watching these people all excited all around me and feeling like I was on the outside, because I had doubts that were going through my head, and I was questioning whether or not I was even saved. And all these things I'm just battling with all these things inside. And as people are all excited and jumping up and down, and there's this joy in the room, I remember feeling like I was on the outside, just lost. And that struggle kind of escalated, because at Wheaton we're required to take philosophy classes, and they don't just present philosophers who are diehard Christians who want to present these arguments for why there's a God. They also want to present philosophers who are atheists, who want to argue that there is no God. And we had to grapple with that stuff. So that only made it even more difficult. And I remember walking on the trail behind the college, just begging God to show me that He was there, because I felt so lost and so just didn't have a foundation. But I was talking with God, telling Him, where are you, God? I need to know that you're there, and why am I going through all of this? And I know now, looking back, that just as 1 Peter talks about, that those trials come so that our faith becomes stronger and is purified. And I could see how I can see now how God used that struggle to really help me make my faith my own, and not just my parents' faith, but something that was my own faith.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm going through some trials, and I'm with a men's group that is just awesome, called Real Men 300. But anyway, one of the things they talk about is that tribulation brings revelation, and I so much believe that is true, and that God uses trials and our struggles to help us grow and shape us. So thank you for being vulnerable and sharing that story with us too. I'm sure I'm sure there's many out there who appreciate that. So let's talk about your occupation now. So you decided to be a teacher. When did you decide that, and why did you choose that profession?
Okay, so here's another reference back to the past. There was an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie called Kindergarten Cop, that I remember going to with my friend Chip in high school, and this movie had Arnold Schwarzenegger in his prime, with his grizzled face and his muscles, and his guns that he had, and he was an FBI agent, and he's taking down all these drug dealers, and the FBI asked him to go undercover to become a kindergarten teacher and try to catch this one drug dealer that would maybe show up at this kindergarten at some point. And so he says, "Oh, no problem, I can do that because teaching's easy." So he signs up for this undercover spot, and he finds out that teaching is not easy. It's very difficult, and these kids are overwhelming for him, their questions and their insecurities and all that. So he struggles a little bit, but then he starts to figure it out, and the kids begin to love him, and he recognizing how beautiful teaching is. And I remember watching that movie thinking, teaching can be manly. Like you can be a strong man and be a leader and step in and help these kids who are desperate. It's not just for women; it's also for men. And so I remember thinking maybe I'll do that someday. But I still went to Wheaton with the idea that I was going to be a lawyer. So I was thinking, okay, I'm going to sign up for political science. I took one political science class and realized, no, this is definitely not for me. I don't want to be a lawyer. And then because it's a liberal arts school, we were required to take literature classes. So I took a class from a professor named Dr. Lundeen, and he's in heaven now. But oh my goodness, this man was passionate about literature, passionate about people, and passionate about talking about the human need for God. And even he'd use secular literature, secular stories to talk about, do you see, this person's desperate hope for a community and relationship and love? And he'd say that shows we were designed for a God who loves us, and we have this empty hole that can only be filled by him. So we'd have these great discussions in his class. I remember watching him pace, back and forth in his classroom, and then lean in close to a kid and ask a question that would get everybody talking. So when I watched him teach, and he was a pastor before he was a professor, I remember watching him teach just thinking, man, the conversations in this class about stories and about a God who loves us, and even using secular literature to talk about these things just is awesome. Maybe I could do this someday as a high school teacher, as an English teacher. So I really started to pursue that more and got involved in the education program, and then started to feel God's call on my life to do that despite being an introvert, because I was an extreme and still am a pretty big introvert, where talking in front of people can be, terrifying. So, but God still calls me to this place where I knew I'd feel a little bit overwhelmed, which is interesting, because I think God does that a lot in the Bible. You see people who are called to different positions, like Moses, or even Mary, or all these different people, and they feel overwhelmed, but God's like, that's the point. I want you to recognize that I'm here and that I love you, and you're going to need me in the midst of this calling, because you feel overwhelmed.
Well, I think probably all of us can point to an individual teacher who made a difference in our lives, maybe sometimes more than one, but usually it's one. It's one that just sticks out. And that's always made me think about how unique that profession is, as far as the ability to really make an impact on someone at an important age. So I totally get the being drawn to that. The other thing a couple thoughts I had, one of them was, teaching is one of those things that really all of us should do at some level in our job, even if it's only once in a while, like helping a new employee learn the ropes or whatever. But teaching is like a blessing that we all can incorporate into all of our work. but for it to be your entire occupation, wow, that's pretty wild. I can't wait to hear more about it. But the other thing I wanted to say real quick was, just a reminder when you said Arnold Schwarzenegger, I think that should be a reminder to all of us that no matter what we're doing, we can make a difference in someone's lives. I would never have thought of Arnold Schwarzenegger inspiring someone in this way, but he did. And so there's another example of someone that can make a difference no matter what their occupation is.
Yeah, that's right. It's amazing. It's amazing how God shows up in ways that we never expect, just to inspire us and call us into different places.
Absolutely. So you've always taught in public schools. So talk to us about that. Why did you choose that route, or was it your choice, as opposed to like a Christian private school environment?
I think I chose public schools mainly because I'd grown up going to a public school and seeing how important it is to bring hope into the darkness, into those places that are difficult, and show kids that they're, and especially today, kids are struggling with anxiety and depression. Anxiety is going through the roof, especially after COVID, where kids are, just overwhelmed by circumstances that they face. So offering a little bit of hope in that environment is a huge way to bring light into the classroom. And I saw my mom, she was very committed to battling and advocating for students in the public school. She would talk with administrators about curriculum and stand up with a microphone and present her side of an argument for why we should have one curriculum versus another curriculum. So I watched her battle and be an advocate, and growing up in that public school was big for me. And I remember wearing these Christian t-shirts that were popular in the 80s and 90s, like God's Gym, and it has a picture of, has a picture of Samson with his muscles, and he's bringing down the pillars with his muscles, and the Dead Sea Beach Club with Moses laying there with his sunglasses on, and he's sitting in the middle of these parted water, and he's sipping some kind of daiquiri or something. But I remember wearing these t-shirts, thinking, I'm a light for God in the midst of a dark place. And so even in high school as a student, I remember thinking, this is something I'm excited about. I invite kids to youth group, but then that was still in me as I came out of the education program and thought, I'm going to go back there to public schools and try to be a light and an encouragement to kids who are desperate for that. And also, when I was in 7th grade, I went through some real bullying. I was there were some 9th graders in the 7th grade hallway, and I remember they'd pick on me just about every day, and even to the point of picking me up and swinging me around by my feet and laughing. And I remember my dad was busy. He was in the midst of private practice, and it wasn't really communicated clearly by me that I was struggling. I felt alone in the midst of that bullying as a 7th grader, and desperate for some adult, someone to show up and be there to offer some love and support. And so I think that also is deep inside me, this desire to see kids and show them that they're not alone. And just by doing that, you communicate really something that's super valuable to Jesus, is just seeing people and loving them and showing them that they have value.
I'm glad you brought that up. I think bullying is such a big deal as far as trauma for kids, and that carries on into adulthood. I know I was bullied like in 6th grade, and for whatever reason, I didn't share it with my parents. And from what I've heard talking to other people, it's not uncommon, either because of fear or shame. I don't know what it is, but a lot of kids don't confide in others. And as I look back on it, I thought, man, some teacher must have noticed that I was being picked on, and why didn't they do something? So the fact that was something in particular that you were motivated by, I think is great. And do you have any advice for those of us listening who are parents to maybe help kids share if they're being bullied? I guess just bring it up as a topic, huh?
Yeah, I think bring it up as a topic and make a space for kids to talk. That could be in the car, driving somewhere for a practice, or it could be going to some tournaments, or just taking a walk together. But I think making spaces for kids to talk where they'll open up about things going on, that's a key thing, because kids do want to share, but there is that initial hurdle of feeling ashamed or feeling insecure. And I think all Christian parents want to show their kids that they're loved and that they're valued. And I think when kids know that, they feel safe with that, and there's space for them to talk, they'll share what they're dealing with.
Great. Well, so I understand you actually made a choice not just to teach, but at some point you decided to start writing stories about your teaching experience. What led you to decide to do that?
I think because I had been I'm almost at 28 years of teaching in the public school, and after all these years, I've just seen God show up over and over and over again in the classroom in so many different ways, in little ways, just like not having enough handouts or thinking I don't have enough handouts and praying and I'm passing out these handouts and I have the exact number of handouts I need to give so I don't have to run to the copy machine and make more handouts. Like little things like that where I'll send up a quick prayer, or something big where there's a suicide and kids are wondering, how do we deal with this? And I see God walk us through those tragedies and show us his love in the midst of it. So I see God so powerfully show up in these places. And I think we talk about God in the midst of sacred places like church and Bible studies, and places where retreats, places where we expect to experience God. But what's powerful is God loves to show up in messy places and broken places. I mean, we just went through Christmas and celebrated God showing up in a manger and using a messy place where there's animal poop and noises of cows and then God shows up in the midst of that. And I think he likes showing up in the midst of hard, difficult settings in our lives and showing us that he's there, that he's present, and that he loves us and that he sees us. So that's a big reason why I want to write these stories, is just to show people, man, guys, I know that public schools have a bad rap with drive-by shootings and huge class sizes and gangs and all that. And there is that stuff there, but there's also God showing up there in beautiful ways and using kids powerfully to bring light into dark places.
Well, do you have a particular story, just as an example of the type of stories that you share, that you wanted to share with us?
Oh yeah, definitely. There's a story of a girl. So I write stories once every 2 weeks, and I send them out to an email list of people because I feel like people connect with stories a lot. They don't want this to be. There's a place for preachers and people to bring sermons to them, but our hearts come alive, and obviously it's because I teach about stories, but our hearts come alive when we talk about stories. And so I write these stories that I put out once every 2 weeks, and I send it to an email list of people. And one particular story that I think I'll share is about one girl who was being bullied, and it was more on social media. People were posting her picture on social media and saying horrible things about her, and then isolating her, like not talking to her in the hallways, and there's some comments being said. Anyway, she was starting to feel more and more lonely and ostracized. And she was in my 7th period class. So as we did class, I'd talk to her and see how she's doing, and often she would stay after class to talk with me and tell me some of the stuff that she's dealing with. And after class was okay because I had a student teacher with me this one year, and she'd be with me when this student was talking with me. But one day she came in at lunch and she wanted to talk at lunch, and she said, "Can you and I have lunch together?" And in a public school, a male teacher hanging out with a female privately for lunch is something you definitely should not do. And so there are boundaries set up, and this conversation that this girl wanted to have was something that I was nervous how I'd handle it. I didn't want to reject her and say, "No, I'm sorry, we can't talk. We can't go there." And I didn't want to invite her into the teacher area where all the teachers are kind of talking about what's going on in their lives and having their own private time, their time away from class. So I didn't really know what to do. I was at a loss, and I didn't want to just say, "Hey, can you just go off to lunch and maybe we'll talk after school?" Or I didn't know what to do. And so I'm praying like, "God, help me with this." I'm really quickly praying, "God, help me with this." And all of a sudden this girl walks in. Her name's Jazzy. And she walks into my classroom and she says, "Hey, Mr. Ahnfeldt, are we having Bible study today?" Because there was a weekly Bible study that some of the high school students would have in my classroom. And I said, "No, actually we're doing those at night now, Jazzy, I'm sorry." And but she'd walked in right when I'm praying this prayer, like, "God, help me in the midst of the situation of how to encourage the student without having this private lunch with her." And so then Jazzy looks at the student who's in the classroom, and she says, "Hey, what are you doing here?" And the girl's like, "Oh, I was just hanging out, getting ready to have some lunch." And Jazzy and Jazzy's a believer. That's why she was there. She was there for Bible study, and she's a believer, and she just loves Jesus like crazy. And this is another example of kids and the impact they can have as a light for the Lord in the public school. But she says, "Hey, you mind if I sit with you?" And Jazzy did not know this girl at all. She says, "You mind if I sit with you?" So they sit down on this couch in my classroom, and the two of them start talking. And Jazzy's introducing herself and asking her how she's doing, and they start talking, and they hit it off immediately. And I just sort of fade out and walk out of the classroom. And just the two of them sit there and talk. And Jazzy just ministers this girl and loves on her in a beautiful way, in a way that I never could. And that's the thing that's incredible is God saw that girl dealing with bullying and saw her need, but also saw me and my struggle with having needing these boundaries. And he showed up and he offered a solution. And I walked away knowing I had experienced God and his goodness, his grace in the midst of a difficult situation.
That is beautiful. That reminds me of, so often we pray for God to show us what we can do, and we focus on ourselves. And it's good to think about how we can be, used by God. But I've thought about this lately too, that, when it comes to praying about my work or personal life, whatever it is, that I focus too much on my situation or my role in a situation and forget about God's got this massive plan and that he's in control. And so maybe a lot of times a better prayer is just, God, show me what you're doing, or show me what you're going to do. And if I can play a part in that, great. If not.
Oh, yeah, I totally agree, Dave. I think that God is an author, and that's what I wrote my book about, is God being the author of our story. And as an English teacher, I see him in so many ways in control of the settings of our lives. I was telling you about being in a public school setting and how God likes messy settings. I think he's in control of the settings of our lives. He's in control of the characters that get introduced into our stories. He's in control of even the symbolism, and I don't think we talk about symbolism enough. But God loves symbols, and I think he's in control of the symbolism of our lives and even the conflicts. I was telling you about being at Wheaton and my struggle at Wheaton with assurance of salvation and doubts. And I believe that God gave that struggle to me, that conflict to me to help me grow and make my faith my own. So yeah, I think when we begin to look at God as the author of the whole story, and we say, God, you do what you want to do with this story, and help me to be, play the role that you want me to play, and just trust him with the pen, let him write the story. I think that's a powerful place to be as a believer.
Well, I think you've already done a great job of introducing my next question, but how do you wrestle through the whole, long-term debate or over God's sovereignty versus free will? And how do you think about that? In other words, we each have free will, we each have choices to make, we're accountable for our choices, and yet God is still in control. How do you reckon that?
That's a big question. Obviously, that's something that an entire book couldn't tackle completely and resolve, but I do think that we need to celebrate both. We need to celebrate that God is in complete control, that he sees the entire story from beginning to end. He's the Alpha and the Omega. He is sovereign over all of it. He's the creator, which means that he does beautiful work. He makes sunsets, he makes sunrises, and he writes our stories. And sunsets and sunrises in our stories are equally beautiful. And so we need to celebrate just God's total control, his sovereignty, his creativity. But we also need to celebrate the fact that he has given us the opportunity to make choices and to have freedom to make choices, because we couldn't have love without that. If we were robots and we were made to come towards him and pursue him, then that wouldn't be love, because we're not choosing him. And when I asked my wife to marry me, I didn't force her to marry me. She chose to marry me. And so that's I feel loved that she chose me, this messy, broken man. And so that's a big piece of something we need to celebrate. And also, it's not only gives the opportunity to love, choice not only gives the opportunity to love, but he also gives us the opportunity to be creative. And I think being made in God's image, we are creative beings. You host this podcast, Dave, and you love it, and you're creative with it. And you've written a book about Jesus being in the workplace, and you're creative with that. And we play with Legos when we're little, and we're given the opportunity to make babies and have gardens and cook things, and we're creative. And if we didn't have choice, that makes creativity impossible. We can't do anything original. And so choice gives us the opportunity to be creative. It also gives us the opportunity to have faith. if with choice we can choose to trust God and believe, or we can choose to not trust God and walk away. And so there's the opportunity for faith too. So I think we have to celebrate God's control, and we have to celebrate the fact that we have choices. And then in terms of resolving that, I think we need to come to a place where we can accept the fact that we will not figure all of it out. That both of those exist, and we won't figure all of it out. There's a verse that I love so much. It's 2 Corinthians 4:8, and it's Paul saying that he's perplexed, but he's not in despair. In other words, he's got all these questions, but he doesn't lose hope in the midst of the questions. So that actually became really important to me a while ago when one of my students, and I write about this in my book, one of my students committed suicide at the school. And he was in my first period class. And so school was halted, and the assistant principal came over the loudspeaker and put us on lockdown because she didn't know exactly what was going on. And then the school, after that day, everyone was sent home. And after that day, and what happened with this student of mine, all these students and the whole entire school just was sent into this tailspin of, why did this happen? How could anybody let this happen? Why did he choose to do this? And obviously I had all kinds of questions. But right before that happened, a week before, I met with some teachers, and we meet once a week, some teachers and I, and we were praying together. And before we prayed, we read Isaiah 40. And that's where we read the end of it, where it says, "Why do you complain, Jacob? Why do you say, Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, my cause is disregarded by my God?" Because people back then, when Isaiah 40 was written, had all kinds of questions and felt like God didn't see them. And we felt the same way at Doherty, that God, where are you, God, in the midst of all this? Like, do you see us? Do you see our struggle? And a little ways down, if you read in Isaiah 40, it says in verse 28, he will not grow tired or weary, talking about God. He will not grow tired or weary, and his understanding no one can fathom. God understands, like he sees us in the midst of our struggle, and he loves us in the midst of it. And we can rest in that he understands he's in control in the midst of these hard things. And the fact that this guy chose to end his life, we can't put that on God, because that's in a weird way, that's God giving him the pen and showing him love by saying, you can make choices, you can make whatever choices you want. And we can use those choices to lead into destruction, or we can use those choices and we can write our story. We can write our story and use that pen to take us to places where we find life and we find hope, and we connect with the author of the story.
Well said. Good answer to a very difficult question. When we talk about trials and challenges in life, you could put them into maybe two categories. Let's say things that are maybe thrust upon us that we didn't have any control over, and then there's the ones that we did have control over, that you might say are self-induced. What advice would you give to any of our listeners who are struggling with the second category, and they're feeling regret or dealing with the consequences of bad choices that they made?
Oh, that's a great question. I think I look at Peter and his story, because, man, you look at Peter and his story, you can definitely see the author's handiwork in that story, because it starts off with Peter being in a boat, and Jesus shows up and he says, "Hey, why don't you try casting your net on the other side of the boat?" And so Peter throws his net on the other side of the boat, and then this incredible thing happens where he has all these fish, even though he'd been fishing all night and never caught anything. And then he realizes, man, this Jesus guy is incredible. And he makes the choice to follow him, which is a good choice. And so he follows Jesus. And then later on down the road, Peter makes good choices and bad choices. He chooses to say that Jesus is the rock and that he's the Christ, and that's a good choice and that's a good thing. And he becomes a leader among the disciples. But then he makes a bad choice, and he tells Jesus, when Jesus says he's going to be crucified, he says, "No, what are you doing?" He rebukes Jesus. He says, "What are you talking about? Why are we doing this?" Actually, I don't think it really tells what he said, but he's basically telling Jesus not to talk about dying and crucifixion. And then Jesus rebukes him and says, "Get behind me, Satan, because you have in mind the things of men and not the things of God." And so he makes a bad choice there. And then when Jesus is about to be crucified, Peter pulls out his sword and cuts off a guy's ear. And he makes a bad choice there. And then he makes a bad choice when he denies Jesus 3 times. And so his story is full of bad choices that I think we all can relate to, because we all make these terrible choices. But then you see God in total control. Jesus tells him he's going to deny him 3 times. So Jesus knows the story. He knows the whole story. And he says, you're going to deny me 3 times. And then at the end of the story, there's this beautiful moment where Jesus is walking with Peter, and he says, do you love me, Peter? And Jesus says, yes. And he says, well, then feed my sheep. And he does it 3 times, which gives Peter this opportunity to say he loves Jesus 3 times after he denied him 3 times. It's this beautiful moment of reconciliation that is very symbolic and very powerful. And Jesus knows exactly what he's doing with Peter's story. And so Peter gets reconciled with Jesus. And it's this beautiful moment that would not have happened if Peter didn't deny him originally 3 times and didn't make that bad choice. So this beautiful moment happens because of Peter's bad choice. And then Jesus takes something bad and he weaves it into something beautiful and good. And at the end of the story, before Jesus leaves, he tells Peter, he tells him the end of his story. He says, you're going to be taken to a place that you don't want to go to by some people who you don't even know. And he tells him the end of the story. So you see Jesus in control of the entire story, but in the midst of there's good choices and bad choices that Peter makes. And Jesus takes those choices and he makes it into something beautiful. And Peter is a stronger man because of it, and more in love with Jesus because of the way Jesus takes his bad choices and his difficulties and makes it into something beautiful. And I think the Bible's full of people making bad choices and then God using that for good.
Oh, I agree, and I think Peter is such an excellent example to illustrate that point. But you're right. I mean, one of the many things that has convinced me without a doubt that the Bible is God's word and it's true is the authenticity of showing all the negative aspects of all these people in the Bible, and including the people who wrote the books, that they admitted the things that they had screwed up on and made mistakes about. When we talk about this topic of sharing stories, a simple way for all of us to share a story, without having to write a book or do a podcast or whatever, is to just share our testimony in an authentic way with others.
Definitely. I think that people are drawn in by stories, and you can't argue with someone's experience. You can argue with people's arguments. Like if someone says, well, here's a point why God exists, or here's a point why I know that Jesus is Lord, and you bring up your points and other people bring up their points, and there's an argument that goes back and forth. You can argue with people's arguments, but you can't argue with someone's story. And so if we are talking with someone and we say in an authentic way, here's something that I've experienced that was so powerful for me, and you tell your story about how you've seen God and how you felt loved and seen by him, people might at first think it's awkward because maybe they don't believe in God, but they respect it because they respect your experience and they respect your story. And I think that's something that's very valued in our society, is respecting people's stories and their experiences. It's maybe not valued. Maybe being a Christian is not valued today in our society as much. Believing in God might not be as valued in our society as much. But when you tell your story and your experience and you relate that to somebody in a humble, authentic way, people listen and they get curious. And if they really are seeking truth and they really are pursuing a relationship and community, they'll ask questions. I've had many colleagues that I've worked with and students I've worked with who don't believe in God. And when I talk about my faith from my own experience, they respect that, and a lot of times they want to hear more.
That is so well said. It just made me think that, as conservative Christians, a lot of us, I'm not that crazy about that term anymore, to be honest, but anyway, a lot of us are, upset about the fact that there's this trend of this thinking that there is no truth, that everyone has their own truth and there's no absolute truth, and that is wrong. But your comments there just made me think about how we could actually use that to our advantage, because in this world of political correctness, you're right, there is a tolerance for somebody's truth, and our testimony could be received by someone who wouldn't receive, someone dogmatically saying this is the word of God, but they would be open to you just sharing what your experience was.
Yeah. Oh, that's so true. So true.
Yeah, wow, that got me thinking. I could use that. Um, well, this has been an awesome discussion. So, if any of our listeners would like to hear more from you, maybe get on your email list and receive your stories, and I understand you've got a book you're writing, how would they learn more about you or reach out to you?
Thanks for asking, Dave. The best way probably to get a hold of me and to get on the email list to get those stories I send out once every 2 weeks is to sign up, is to go to my website, which is Ahnfeldt.com, ERIN, Ahnfeldt, AHNFELDT.com, AaronAhnfeldt.com. And when they go there, they'll come to my homepage, and there's a little drop down, some words that say your story has a plan, a purpose, and an author. Let's look for him together. And there's a button they can click on to join me, or then they can go to the bottom, and there's a little write up about the stories that I send out once every 2 weeks. And they can click on any of those tabs there, or those little buttons there, and be on the email list. And then if they do that, they get a little write up that I did called 6 Secrets to Seeing God in Your Story. And it's basically practical ways to see God's handiwork in your story and what He's up to in your story.
That is awesome, and I periodically purge my email because it's so easy to get your email box overloaded. but usually when I get rid of stuff that I don't want to receive anymore, I think about how much I appreciate the emails that I am keeping, and I'm gonna be signing up for this after this interview. So I'm looking forward to getting your next story.
Well, thanks, Dave.
This has been great. Do you have any final thoughts that you want to share with our listeners before we wrap it up?
Yeah, I was praying about this time together in this conversation, and one thing that kept coming to mind was joy. I know that in your book you write about Jesus being present in our workplace, and you have in your subtitle you talk about joy, the joy of being at work and being a part of what God's doing at work. And I've been reading just recently in Habakkuk 3. And that passage talks about the fact that, when there's no crops in the field, and there's no sheep in the pen, and there's no fruit on the tree, yet will I rejoice in the Lord. And I think that that's challenged me a lot, because there are times where I am at work teaching, and it's not always sunshine and butterflies and rainbows. Sometimes it's hard, and I have overwhelming classes where I'm struggling with how to reach these kids. And when it's really hard, I think still we can have joy where we are, where God has us, because He writes the story, because He's in control from beginning to end, and He's got a plan, and He's taking the story in the direction that He wants it to go. If we're acknowledging Him and trusting Him and giving Him the pen to write the story, He's taking that story in the direction He wanted to go. And I think that's why Habakkuk could say, even with all these bad circumstances, even with no sheep in the pen and no fruit on the tree, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. He could say that because he knew that God was in control, and he knew that God was with him. He talks at the end about how God enables him to have the energy of a deer, and to spring like a deer and run like a deer and climb the mountaintops. And he knows that because God's with him. God is with him in the midst of the difficulty, and He's experienced Him. So he can rejoice because God's writing the story, and he can rejoice because God is with him, even though the circumstances at the time are difficult. So I guess I just want to close with just talking about joy and the importance of holding on to that joy, because that, as Nehemiah says, that's our strength. That joy is our strength, and it's powerful the way we shine when we hold on to that joy where God has put us, whether that's at home with your kids, or in the workplace, or wherever it is. When we have that joy, our light is shining bright, and we are strong as Christians.
What a great way to end this. Usually I publish these episodes right first thing on Mondays, so for those of you listening to starting your week off on Monday, let's approach our work with joy. So well said. All right. Well, thank you so much, Erin. I really enjoyed this. Thank you for sharing with us and taking the time, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Dave.
All right. Bye-bye. Men at Work, I hope you've enjoyed this interview as much as I have. We just heard about Erin Ahnfeldt's journey, being Spirit-led and living out his Christian faith through his work. Each of our journeys are unique, but hopefully you've heard something in this episode to inspire you and give direction for your own personal daily work life. You can find links and other information from this show at christianmenatwork.com. Thanks, and God bless.